Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Before I start, just to let everybody know, you can see on the screen the menti.com. You can scan the QR code or you can punch in the number by going on the website, and that will allow you to ask questions. So that's how we are doing the interaction with the audience. And I can see your questions here, just so you know. We'll try our best. No promises which questions we can pick in, but I'll try to accommodate as many questions as we can. Let me start by introducing our guest and distinguished speaker, Reza Baqir. Reza, undergrad from Harvard, Ph.D. in economics from Berkeley, then has had a distinguished career at the IMF. Following that, he was the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan until recently. So he has a lot of practical experience working internationally as well as in Pakistan, working across the centers of power, as they say. So really look forward to learning from him about the way forward for Pakistan. We know Pakistan has had a long period of decline relative to other developing countries in the region and globally. And more recently, it's become even more worrisome. The economic situation is quite bad. And there's always this natural question of what needs to be done and how it should be done. So that's going to be the focus of our conversation. I'm going to start by just asking Reza. He has been in the US meeting different people recently at the IMF. What have you heard, Reza, about Pakistan's perception about where we are?
First of all, Atif, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's really great and inspiring to be at Princeton. My first time after, I think, maybe in more than 2 decades. So thank you very much for the invitation. Let me also say assalamu alaikum to all the viewers who have joined from Pakistan today, and looking forward to this conversation with who I consider to be one of the leading authorities on not only a lot of economics related issues, but also on a lot of economic challenges facing Pakistan. So Atif, my hat's off to you for all the insightful analysis that you share in social media and on your other writings about what Pakistan needs to grapple with. So I've been in the US. I was attending the IMF's spring meetings last week in my capacity in the work that I'm doing in the private sector of building a sovereign advisory services practice. And as part of that, many investors also did want to speak to me about the outlook that I saw for Pakistan as a former policymaker. And I have to say that I really found the investor community and the broader community that would speak to me on Pakistan in 2 camps. And the bigger and the majority camp was one which was of the view that it is almost too late in an economic sense for Pakistan. And what they saw was just a steady, slow path towards an economic implosion. There was a smaller community, and really I had to fish for them, which still thought that there was some way for Pakistan to avoid a full-blown crisis. And I have to say, when I'm out of Pakistan, and especially in public gatherings, and especially, as a former policymaker, I really feel and think as a Pakistani first, and think about what it is and what are the responsibilities to make sure that one's country gets projected well. And let me just start this conversation by saying, Atif, that it was a struggle. It was a struggle on my end to try to show to people that it is not too late and there is a way forward. So I'm looking forward to this conversation where hopefully we can unpack what it means to have a way forward and to prove the majority of whom I heard, to prove them to be incorrect in their outlook.
Yeah, I mean, that's my own reading as well, that the perception clearly is that Pakistan is not the place to go to right now. That's what the investors are saying. That's what the educated are saying. I was just searching. Let me give you a recent thing I just tried. If you go on Google and Google Trends, and you look at the search for visa from Pakistan, how many people are searching for something related to visas in Pakistan? You see an incredible surge over the last year. a surge that you don't see in Bangladesh, you don't see in India, you don't see it worldwide, but you see a surge for visas in Pakistan. And that in some meaningful way summarizes what the people on the ground, those who have opportunities to be able to go outside Pakistan, are feeling right now in terms of, again, the economic environment. In my mind, what that means is that it's really for the people in power in Pakistan, whoever they might be, on the political side, on the bureaucratic side, on the establishment or the military side, that they need to understand that where Pakistan is right now is a cumulative effect of very bad and poor decisions that have been made at a strategic level in Pakistan, both on the economic as well as on the political/security front. And it is a cumulative result of those policies, many of them were deliberately put in place, that we are where we are today as a country. Now, the flip side of that is that if we want to look forward, which we obviously must, it requires a change that is structural in nature, a change that is a meaningful change to the outsiders that says things will be done differently. And that's something I want to talk to you, Reza, about. How can we make that change which has that meaningful, and we use this word often, credibility and commitment with the investors, but most importantly with the people of Pakistan themselves. So they are not forced to go on Google and search for visas when they are living in Pakistan. The government is losing credibility with its own people, which I find to be the most serious issue here. Of course, it has credibility issues with the IMF. Of course, it has credibility issues with the investor, as Reza's experience also shows recently. But most importantly, the government is losing credibility with its own people, and that is the thing that needs to reverse. So I want to talk to you, Reza, about that process of building credibility. And it requires institution building. It requires a different way of thinking and working. And what, in your view, would be some of the starting points to move in that, or to start moving in that direction?
For me, the starting point has to be people. And, for me, just to give you a little bit of insight into how did my experience start in the State Bank of Pakistan. I had been living in the United States for quite some time when I came here for college, and then I went to graduate school, and then I happened to get a job at the IMF, and then was happily doing that job. And I had been out of Pakistan more than I had been in Pakistan. So when I got this opportunity, and a real honor to go back, the first question I had to address was people. That if you want to try to start something that is going to be longer lasting than yourself, how do you get capacity? How do you get people to internalize what you think are the right ways to think about it? So I, on my part, was very keen that after my own appointment, I bring in deputy governors who, can help in that goal. And I brought in Murtaza Sayyed, who used to be at the IMF. I had resigned from the IMF, and the IMF makes it very difficult to resign from the IMF because they have lots of very good retirement packages and benefits for you. So to let go of that and to become a central bank governor in a country where most of your predecessors have not completed their term, and also Pakistan being a noisy democracy has all sorts of challenges that it gives to people in far more important positions than the governor of a central bank. But I was very happy, that we had good deputy governors. We had him. We had Seema Kamil, who was and is there. She was the former CEO of one of the largest banks, one of the largest private banks in Pakistan, a lady of impeccable reputation. And we invested a bit, therefore, in some structural things that then the deputy governors could carry on. So, for instance, on the monetary policy side, that was under Murtaza, we started a tradition that after every MPC meeting, every meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, we would make ourselves available to the analyst community. So we started a tradition of post-MPC calls that is still continuing. And if you're not on it, you can just write to the State Bank and ask yourself to be put on it, where for the first time, the senior officials of the State Bank would make themselves available. Similarly, Seema did a tremendous job at bringing forward an agenda on inclusion and digitization. Now, I'm giving you these examples because to me it was very important to build capacity. When I look around in Pakistan, and I think, you look at the State Bank of Pakistan, that is still a relatively small institution in terms of the impact that it has on the overall economic direction of the country. And really, one needs to think about the government, and one needs to think about how do we try to ensure that those in government who are making decisions on matters that are economic and often matters that are technical have the right balance of political representation, that there is at the very, very top decision makers who are elected, because that's the essence of democracy, but also that there are technocrats, there are people from the civil service who are equipped to deal with fairly technical economic issues, whether it's fiscal policy. What is the right tax policy? And I know we'll get into that. That not only is good for getting the budget deficit to be in a good zone, but also is one that is going to give incentives for growth. It's going to give incentives for export-driven investment, for incentives for technology transfer, and a whole host of areas. That is a challenge. I worked with many finance ministers in my 3-year tenure, and I worked with even a greater number of finance secretaries. And I have to say, and I have a lot of respect for everybody that I've worked with, but I did also recognize that there are capacity constraints within the various ministries in Pakistan. If you take the finance division, for example, the finance secretary and all the finance secretaries that I worked with, were really trying to keep a lid on a really challenging situation. But if you go one level below, some additional secretaries, that's the one level below, were good. They were people that they could rely on. But then often beyond that, it would get very difficult even for the finance secretary to have that kind of expertise to ensure that good fiscal decisions are made on a systematic manner. So I don't know what is the answer to that. In my time at the State Bank, I thought that if I bring in good deputy governors, then it will cascade down. But how does one do that at the government level? I have, some thoughts. Maybe we can talk, if we talk a little bit more about fiscal policy challenges, how to insulate the cyclicality in our fiscal policy, how to insulate politics and some really basic fiscal outcomes. But the broader question of people and capacity, all I can say is that, I decided to quit my job at the IMF to do public service. And I would just make a plug that for Pakistanis in Pakistan who are considering public service but are afraid to try it, or for Pakistanis outside Pakistan who, think that it's a good idea to do public service but are nervous, I would really encourage you that if your personal capacity allows you, try it. I know it's difficult. I know you may think that you may not be able to make a difference, but guess what? If you don't try, you will never know. And what's the worst that can happen? That you tried and it didn't work? It is still worth trying, given the paucity of a capacity that we have in many institutions in Pakistan.
Well, they say personnel is policy, right? I mean, and that's very real. And certainly in a country like Pakistan, you have to build from the ground up. So it's just like a CEO building a startup, right? You have to build the team first. And that basic realization one finds is lacking at the level, at the highest level when it comes to political parties and their appointments. I mean, Reza will not say it, but I can say it from the outside. Like, it was disappointing, to be honest, to see that when there is a new government coming in, and I've been critical of the new government on that score in particular, that they're, that they let go of very competent people like Murtaza, like Reza, because they did not sort of value meritocracy to the extent that it really needs to be if Pakistan is to move in the right direction. And that sort of political behavior repeatedly, it has implications. And I can again give you some examples. I know that governments, they ask certain people, okay, are you interested in this job or that job? That Reza said we should try and go for public service. But people then see how people who do go for public service, how they are treated ultimately by the same politicians or the next guy who comes in. So I think, there needs to be a different norm or culture that you can have, partisanship, but there needs to be a respect for sort of the professional class that is trying to work inside the government or with the government, that some norms should be made relatively more apolitical. And you need to do that if we are really to go in the direction of institutions like the State Bank or others that we can talk about. When we talk about independent institutions, that independence comes with respect of that independence from those who are in power. Because people are like Reza are not going to go on streets and say, how dare you try to do this or that. They need the politicians to respect their independence. Because if they don't respect that independence, or the judiciary for that matter, if there is not respect for the independence of these institutions from the politicians themselves, there is no other notion of independence left. And that's very important. Those people, those processes, those institutions are very important for trying to make the kind of structural change that we are talking about. Reza, let me move to some specifics on policy. And I know you have thought about it. You have talked about the sort of the fiscal problems facing Pakistan. So often the country has a big hole in the budget, running large deficits, but it also has a major cyclical dimension. And there is a very close association between the running up fiscal deficits larger than average and then getting into balance of payment problems as well. So there's a very close connection between fiscal deficit and current account deficit or balance of payment problems. So Reza, how do you see that? And in particular, if we think about changing that boom-bust cycle, which to at least some extent is driven by the fiscal expansion, perhaps driven politically or for whatever reason, how do you think we can kind of tame that beast, so to speak?
Excellent question, Atif. Let me come to it, but just let me make one additional comment to what we were talking about just before about people. And I think, to me, what we really need to figure out is people also respond to incentives. And how do we have a system where, irrespective of the name of whoever is in charge, they are making the right decisions, and they themselves are selecting people around them who are making the right decisions. I'll speak about the central bank just to finish on this point. The governor there right now, Jamil Ahmed, the deputy governor in Aysan, Seema, I already spoke about. I have a lot of respect for both of them. And I think we need to, and I worked with Jamil, he was a deputy governor when I was governor. I think we need to think of how do we ensure that the space in which they get the right incentives as well, including the protection from other stakeholders and powers in Pakistan to do the right thing, which I know that they want to do the right thing. Let's talk about fiscal. I tweeted a chart that to me was very striking about how really is a very, very tight relationship between current account deficits and fiscal deficits. And in fact, you can see systematically over the last 10, 20 years, whenever fiscal deficits have grown, it has been the leading cause of current account deficits. So the question becomes, what governs the path of fiscal deficits in Pakistan? And how can we try to have a system whereby a fiscal deficit is not just, say, driven by the political cycle? And it's not just by the political cycle. It is, in fact, within the same government sometimes. You have a change in leadership in the finance ministry. In the PDI government, you had a change in finance ministers who had different views on the fiscal path. And in the current government, you've also had a change in finance ministers who have had different views on key fiscal questions. So the question that I'm interested in is how do you insulate the course of fiscal deficits from the political cycles? And I think there may be merit for Pakistan to learn from the experience of some other countries such as Chile that have had fiscal frameworks. Chile in particular had a structural fiscal balance rule and also now has an autonomous fiscal council. And perhaps, there is some merit to thinking about whether it is possible within the structure of Pakistan that the level of the deficit, which really matters as far as stability, macroeconomic stability is concerned, the level of the deficit is decided by a decision-making body that thinks beyond the political cycle. It can definitely have the finance minister in it, but maybe it needs to have other stakeholders in it as well. Or the level of the deficit is a decision that is delegated, in fact, to the finance secretary, the highest level civil servant, who is then, though, insulated and protected from political pressure and perhaps is guided by a form of an autonomous fiscal council, a bit analogous to the discussion that we have on central bank independence, where a central bank's goals are determined by the government, but its pursuit of its execution of the instruments, the way it uses its instruments in the pursuit of those goals, are supposed to be independent. So perhaps, we are in such a sharp, acrimonious political crisis that is having tremendous economic ramifications. It would almost be a waste that coming out of this crisis, as I'm sure we will, we do not, in fact, make some structural interventions on the economic front and think about the governance of the policy-making institutions. So I would want to put on the table what kind of a decision-making or a governance mechanism we need such that the level of the deficit is insulated from political cycles. The level of the deficit does not automatically suffer whenever the identity of the finance minister changes, and has broader, either delegated to, say, the most senior civil servant, who then is held accountable in the form of a board that is independent, or the level of the deficit is escalated so that it is not only a decision of the government, but also a leader of the opposition, also other key stakeholders in Pakistan that have an interest, and whether, from the forefront or from other dimensions, have an important say on how things unfold. But if you look at the chart that I sent out, and if you look at the amplitude of the variation in the deficit, from year to year, it can vary by 3 percentage points of GDP. It is impossible to have macroeconomic stability on a long-term basis if our fiscal deficit is going to be swinging by several percentage points of GDP. So the question is, what kind of an institution that we can have? Are there lessons that we can learn from Chile as well as other countries to insulate the cyclicality of the budget deficits from political parties, but also within political parties from the identity of the finance minister?
Yeah, this question of macro stability is extremely crucial. In my mind, that's the starting point of moving forward, is to first gain a handle in a credible way on stability at the macro level in terms of exchange rate, in terms of inflation, in terms of people's expectations of durability of policy that you put in place. And to give that level of commitment and credibility to the outsiders, it's really important to strengthen and bolster this notion of these independent sort of boards and councils that are then given the charge of running monetary policy in the case of central bank, but also on the fiscal side of managing the size of the fiscal deficit. And they are very useful examples, like the example of Chile that Reza mentioned. I want one consequence of the lack of fiscal space, Reza, is that it's not just the size of the expenditure, but the composition of the expenditure that the government has, that it's very much driven towards just pure expenditure, which is to say consumption, paying salaries, things of that nature. There is very little room left, despite the very high, ironically, deficit. There's very little room left for investment. And as everyone knows, Pakistan's core problem, like core problem of any poor country, is growth. Like, you need to grow out of poverty. That's the only long-term solution to poverty. But without investment, you cannot have growth. Again, take the energy problem. Pakistan has to transition to more efficient, renewable ways of generating energy. And clearly, if you were to do like a net present value calculation, all of these investments would hugely pay off. There is just absolutely no doubt on it. Just to give you one little example, I was helping a student do a project on agriculture in Pakistan. And he was showing me various calculations for small farmers of how much profit they can make if they farm efficiently, given their size and scale of what resources available to them. And net profit at the end of the year, if they do very well, it's like order of a few $100s, right? That's what we are talking about. The question is, then I asked myself, okay, what if we were to convert that land into solar farms? And you can do a back of the envelope calculation of what they would earn if given the current per kilowatt hour payment that the grid is charging, if they can sell at some discount to that into the grid, and all they do is invest to build those solar plants over the land, because Pakistan in general is very good, well suited for generating solar electricity. It's orders of magnitude better for them to generate energy into the grid. It's renewable, and then they can, then all of the associated industries can get set up that might be energy intensive and currently infeasible in those rural areas. But what's the problem? The problem is to transition to that sort of a decentralized energy grid, if you will. In this example, you need to first invest in the infrastructure that these farms can be connected to the grid and so on. So that's going to require investment. It's clearly profitable in the long run, but the government currently does not have resources, right? I'm just using this example to illustrate one very fundamental problem that has to be solved, which is moving away from this consumption-driven economy to an economy that has much more room for investment and that makes the kind of investments that I just gave example of. So I want to raise that issue, and it's there in both the private sector and the public sector, which is what are the things that can be done to generate more room for investment in both the public sector as well as the private sector.
So let me start with a very, very difficult issue to tackle, and that is land. And I think, Atif, you've written about this eloquently, and would draw attention to what you have put out there. And our system of de facto encouraging savings by investing in land, and often land that's unproductive. And how our system of taxation is one which essentially allows the returns on those investments to have a much smaller effective tax rate than other typical forms of investment. Why would anybody right now put their money or save through banks when effectively their return on those savings is negative in real terms? Inflation right now is 35%. If you invest even in treasury bills, that's the highest you could get. A bank deposit would be maybe giving you a return of 18-19%. You are earning negative in real terms. You would be far better off buying some kind of a consumer durable good and sticking on to it. Or land, even for that matter, which if inflation is 35, by definition, its price is going to go up 35% in 1 year, as opposed to the 19-20% return that you're getting. So the first issue is, how do we use tax policy? And this is a good illustration of how maybe these fundamental issues, because they are going to affect a system who are benefiting from the current status quo. Because there is a big industry around just sale and purchase of land. But if we do not systematically address that, and we move away, or at least compete, that the taxation in effective terms is going to be same as whether you save through land or you save through bank or non-bank institutions that intermediate that saving into investment. You've written about this, and I think there are, for instance, as we come out of the current crisis, this is another area that I would really want the decision makers, whoever come in power next, in a holistic manner, taking into account not just the government, not just the next government, but also the next opposition and other stakeholders, to generate ownership for it, to first convince people that this actually is a detriment, and then to develop something then that sticks. The other problem we have is that, as we sometimes come out with policies and they are reversed as soon as the current set of decision makers is gone. One more reason why we should not be so fixated on individuals, but rather making sure that whatever office one occupies, the incentives are such that you are held accountable to the right decisions. I want to give another area where I think there is a lot of need to be done, and that has to do with the role of the financial sector, the banks in particular, and in how well they cater to the savings of people and how well they intermediate that savings into investments. And this In my time as governor, a lot of the time was spent in dealing with the macroeconomic stability issues, dealing with the IMF, dealing with these issues. But the area that I found most exciting was that of financial inclusion and how to bring banks to better cater to the needs of the people as well as the investors. One of the areas that I was very, very happy and excited about was for overseas Pakistanis, an area called Roshan Digital Accounts, which is essentially mobilizing savings from overseas Pakistanis for investment purposes in Pakistan, or even just regular lifestyle banking needs in Pakistan, where Pakistanis were being digitally onboarded into Pakistani banks. Another area that we pushed.
Reza, can you talk a little bit more on that? Because I'm interested in, take Roshan example, the money obviously came in, but one did not see as much was that money then gets connected to real investment. Not necessarily venture capital, but even, investment that is generating employment, investment that is generating real growth.
Correct.
If you could talk how to make that connection better.
So Roshan Digital Account was a innovative, pioneering scheme because there are very few countries that had done this in the form of bank accounts as opposed to selling securities. And our idea was to make it easy for overseas Pakistanis to bank. And just so that you know what we're talking about, if you're a Pakistani and you have a Pakistani overseas card or a passport, you can open a bank account in a Pakistani bank sitting from wherever you are, just so long as you have one of these documents. And the customer due diligence and the know your customer, everything is done remotely, digitally, the technology exists. What we wanted to first do was show proof of concept that you can mobilize a diaspora of the world's 5th largest country in such a way that the magnitudes are significant. And to date, the gross inflows are 6 billion into the Roshan Digital Accounts. This is more than double what the IMF has lent over the past 2 years when we launched this scheme. Now, once you have the proof of concept and you can demonstrate that there is actually a good steady inflow of hard currency earnings, our goal was that then we would have fintechs and others who would come and leverage this to actually generate investment opportunities as well. Right now, a lot of this money is going into meeting the needs of overseas Pakistani families. So for instance, if you're sitting here and you want to take care of your parents' utility bills, if you have a Roshan Digital account, you can do that. We even made it possible that if you want to buy a car for your father or your sibling, you can do that using mouse clicks just sitting from Pakistan. So this was proof of concept. And next stage would have been to develop this into how this can go into investments in the fintech space, how to make it easy for overseas Pakistanis to get access to that. And many fintechs based here were approaching us for that as well. But what happened after the change in government? It would have been great if the new government would have put as much of its weight behind the Roshan Digital Account scheme to own it. They could change the name of it if needed, but it was a scheme that was in the interest of any government, because any government in Pakistan needs foreign exchange. And if you have untapped, a source of a few million overseas Pakistanis and the proof of concept is already there, it's in the country's good. Another point, though, I want to talk about, because we were talking about inclusion, we were talking about savings, is women. And if you look at the statistics on how well women are included in Pakistan's financial system, it's abysmal. And some people think, it is because of cultural or social or religious norms. But if you look at the inclusion rates of women in Pakistan's in a financial system, countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Malaysia are all well ahead than Pakistan in terms of the proportion of women that have a bank account. That's a commonly used metric. So it's definitely more than that. And we started a program called Banking on Equality. I think one of the few central banks that has such a forward-leaning program to basically get banks to do more to source women customers. And we worked with the Pakistan Telecom Authority, as well as NADRA, which is the database agency, to make it possible that if you have a smartphone, and most women do have a smartphone, at least in income brackets where it's affordable, if you have a smartphone, you can have a bank account. And we did the proof of concept of that, and we motivated banks. Unfortunately, that's another area that has not seen the kind of emphasis that it needs. Now, women save. they save in the informal mechanisms, but a lot of the saving does not get translated into how to intermediate it. We can talk of investment maybe separately as to what is needed to think of a different investment policy. For a long time, I've seen people thinking that it should be very laissez-faire, just get the government out and investment will happen. I think I've come to be of the view that that is not the answer for countries like Pakistan, and we need a more proactive approach to figuring out what is the type of investment we want to prioritize and then go after that in a big way. But we can talk more about that if we have space.
That's an interesting question. I'm actually curious to hear about your experience with the private sector in Pakistan. How elastic is the private sector in being able to go in a direction where Pakistan needs to go? So it's and I'm saying partly that with reference to exactly as you said that people talk about it's a question of government getting out of the way. Like take privatization for example, and I think those are all reasonable ideas. I'm not saying, but there is a real question of is there strength in the private sector to take on large, ambitious projects? And if not, what are the real constraints that they are facing? And just to give you one example, if you take textile, which is historically a traditional sector in Pakistan, for many decades, private sector has been involved in it. The government subsidizes it in different ways. And yet, when you look at the performance in value-added terms, in terms of kind of going up the value chain, you don't see Pakistani textile, the private sector, competing as well with the likes of Bangladesh, with the likes of Vietnam, and so on. What's holding them back?
Excellent question. And there is a puzzle here. And the puzzle, I phrase it as follows, is, and I had first had experience with many of the leading industrialist businessmen in Pakistan. And some of the big groups are really very, very dynamic groups doing very, very well. They have huge balance sheets and their profitability speaks for itself. I want to talk about textiles, and then I want to talk a little bit more broadly. So for textiles, I have never understood why does Pakistan not have more foreign direct investment in textiles if it is the leading engine of growth. I think there is but one company only, and that too a Chinese company, that is in textiles. And we have to understand why is that the case. Why are foreign investors not thinking that our textile sector is genuinely competitive? Or have we managed to create some form of formal or informal barriers to entry so that others, and particularly foreign investors, are not coming in and maybe creating a little bit of a shakeup in the industry as well? That's number one. Number two is, given that we have so many textile giants, magnates, why have they not diversified into other areas of economic activity? And there's a question that I used to direct to all of the top businessmen in Pakistan, which is I used to ask them, it's a question about economies of scope rather than economies of scale. So economies of scope, essentially, if you're good at if you become big at doing one thing, you can also do something else in a much more competitive manner than a pure new entrant. What I'm trying to say is that I would ask them, since you clearly have established yourself as a big textile player, why don't you start something new to export? The costs to you of taking that risk are a lot less than the cost to a newcomer. But it was a conversation for 3 years where, aside from maybe very few examples, I don't really see that innovation taking place. And economies of scope means that you already have an HR set up, you already have the civil works, you already have all your connections in government. So if you want to go into, say, some technology transfer area, or if you want to go into IT, or if you want to export something new, you are much better placed. Now, part of the reason is I think some of our incentives in Pakistan are based upon a sector. So there is this list of a few sectors in which textile is one, where if you are in that sector, you get an incentive. And I, for one, have believed that if you have to give an incentive to an exporter, the incentive should be just on the dollar amounts of exports proceeds that get dropped in Pakistani banks, irrespective of the sector you are in. And in fact, I would go further, and if this scheme were being revisited, I would give a greater incentive to any kind of a scheme that, to your point, Atif, about where there is clear technology transfer. It's a new area of growth that helps us to diversify our export. Now, there are examples. I mean, you'd be surprised to know, I was surprised to know, that Pakistan is making tires for trucks that are being driven in the US. It's the first that Pakistani-made tires are being exported to the US and are on American trucks being driven. Now, this story stands out for how unique it is. And why don't we have a lot more stories? If this group, we started this, and they were in a different industry, a very traditional industry, if they could diversify into a new area of exports, and they have demonstrated that that can happen, it really is my plea and encouragement to all the others in Pakistan, leading businessmen who are best placed to innovate into other sectors.
In my mind, part of why the private sector might be hesitant to kind of take your bait, so to speak, and make those investments in new initiatives is, again, goes back to this question of credibility and stability. For Pakistanis living in Pakistan and running companies, of how credible the system is, that if they were to take a leap and start a new capex that will require 5 years for materialization, who knows what will be the policy 5 years down the road. We have seen long waves, as you know, Reza, of massive exchange rate control. And other kinds of policies where tax rebates for the real estate sector, for example, or for land sector, for example. All of these are examples of the government coming in and putting their thumb on the scale, where they're saying, if you are the risk taker who has waited 5 years to start a company in a risky but much more productive, tradable sector, you will be punished. But someone who is doing speculative buying and selling of land will be able to make much more money, and they can also get a tax write-off actually on top of that. So these are some real, like, you know, it's not, at some level, it's not rocket science, but again, I think what the country, that's why it's good that our conversation started from that very fundamental issue of people, processes, governance, and adding credibility to the system. Whether that's done through various boards, making them independent, giving them more authority, so there is more credibility in the system, bringing in that kind of competent people at the top. And by the top, I don't mean make them the prime minister. The prime minister should always be elected by the people. But I'm talking about who the, you know, I've often said that the most important job that the prime minister does, he or she, is because they also have 24 hours in a day. And they don't have to be the smartest person in the room. They often are not. But their most important task is that they select the smartest people for the individual things that their country needs to run. And that selection of competence and then giving them authority, that's called delegation, and giving them the respect that they can sort of continue at their job for the time it takes to finish it and then give the baton to the next person. That process is completely missing in Pakistan, actually. And without that realization in the centers of power in Pakistan, that you cannot wing it. You know, you cannot wing a country of 22 million people. And that's how it feels policies run on a day-to-day basis. And that is what then brings that lack of credibility in the system for people to make the kind of investment that is needed. We have 47 questions. I don't know how I can answer 47 questions in the remaining time that we have. But I do want to come sort of to close our conversation. I want to come, you know, we talked about kind of the nerdy topics of fiscal policy and tax policy and investment and so on. But I teach this to my students, and as any proper economist should know, an economy is not an abstract notion that sits in a vacuum. an economy is embedded in the society and in the social structures. And this question of what is attractive about Pakistan or what is unattractive of Pakistan, that is very much, the answer to that question is also wedded in the social structure and the political structure of Pakistan, in terms of how the society is treating, for example, women, which Pakistan has one of the lowest rates of labor force participation for women, for example. Even though they are the most educated often, they are doing the best in college and schools. But after that, they don't get to the positions of power. They're not given, and again, there is that missing link that you have women who are doing very well, but you don't see them at the top. You don't see them in positions of power. You don't see them because they're not allowed to for various reasons. They're not given the respect, the very simple thing that is needed to be able to work properly. But then there is this question of tolerance. I mean, just today, and it's like this trickle that you keep hearing day in and day out. Just today, there is some Chinese worker, and now he is been behind bars because there is some accusation of religious blasphemy against this Chinese worker. I mean, you can say it is our belief, but you cannot function as a society with these kind of attitudes. That's the reality, and these are the harsh questions that the society and the people in power need to ask themselves. Can you go on like that? Can you go on having a society that is so intolerant towards alternative views, towards women? Can you really afford to have those attitudes and yet somehow undergo that structural transformation that we are talking about? Is there a way forward for Pakistan? In my mind, the answer is a simple no. And if you don't understand, if there is not that realization, I have had sometimes kind of conversations with people where they say, okay, yeah, we can do X, Y, Z, we can change tax policy, but please don't touch these issues, because there's nothing we can do about women and there's nothing we can do about intolerance. Whatever, and my response to that is, if you cannot do anything about that, then forget trying to do anything to move Pakistan in the right direction, because it's a very fundamental thing we are talking about. And so until and unless there is that realization at the top that you need to change the society to change the economy, the two are linked. So when we talk about credibility, when and even countries like Saudi Arabia are realizing that if they need to transition to the modern economy, they need to open up. They need to have at least a greater level of tolerance for women, for alternative viewpoints and so on, because that's the cosmopolitan nature of the world we live in. Princeton will not be able to survive if it starts saying, you can come here, but you must ascribe to this particular philosophy before you can enter my classroom. That's no way to run a university. It's also no way to run a modern country. So again, it was a longer spiel than I should have, but it's something that at least I personally feel is very important. So I want to kind of get your view. I mean, I know your views on Reza, so you're a decent human being, but I want to understand how you view that challenge in Pakistan.
I'll go back again to the transition I made, from having lived outside Pakistan and then having gone to Pakistan. And when you live here, you get used to differences of view being expressed in a very calm, civil manner, where somehow everybody recognizes that the way this debate is going to be won is on clearly established objective criteria of what is the most relevant information to bring on the question that you're debating. What struck me initially when I went was how much, first of all, people were ready to rip each other apart in Pakistan in debate, and how people would get almost angry at differing points of view, and how people would very quickly lose any shared sense of what is the objective criteria upon which a discussion or a point of view can either stand or lose ground. Now, I'm at a loss as to try to figure out how that can happen, because certainly I have not seen people in Pakistan who, if they take the position that they will rise above the fray and remain calm and collected and try to always bring discussion back on substance, they don't seem to carry the day. The people who carry, it seems, the people who carry the day are the ones who are insightful. And they are insightful in person. They try to incite on social media. And I think any forum that seeks to therefore make policy in Pakistan not only needs to encourage discussion, but also needs to lay some ground rules that tolerance and inclusion is the first principle by which policy debates have to be settled. And I would very much wish, as a Pakistani first and foremost, that this principle is also embodied in the current discussions at a political level across all the factions, across the entire political spectrum, because we really do owe it to our people first and foremost to be able to demonstrate progress. And I know it's doable. And the reason I know it's doable is because it's the same Pakistanis, when they come out of Pakistan and they're working in many organizations here, they completely internalize the rules of civil discourse. So it is doable, but we have to figure out how we can incentivize the same type of behavior. I just want to also come back to one thing that you were mentioning at the very end about how, how do we give confidence that something is in fact going to be beyond 5 years when we talk of certain kinds of incentives? And I do want to, it made me think that whatever comes out of the current juncture, and it seems that things are getting so sharp that something will have to happen, is that whoever are the managers, the political and economic managers, I think if all that comes out is a blueprint, as you were saying, that the deficit should be X and such policy lever should be such, I think it would be a waste of this crisis. And really, what we need, I think, coming out of this crisis is creation of some kind of a body or a council or some other forum that is broad-based in Pakistan across the political spectrum and other stakeholders to give confidence, first of all, to Pakistanis, whether they are savers or whether they are investors, that the policies that are being announced are going to have a shelf life of longer than 5 years. And second, to external stakeholders. Right now, I feel sorry for the IMF, because the IMF doesn't know who to trust in Pakistan at this juncture, because not only across governments, but within governments, what has been said has not been delivered. So we also have to solve the IMF's problem of putting in front of them a body that they actually feel that they can trust irrespective of who is in power, and that the commitments that are being made to them are going to last beyond either the name of the political party or the name of the finance minister who may be in charge.
That's a great point, and I think this is a good point to kind of close on as well, which is that that basic core that every functioning country has, which is good or bad, you can say whether they're doing it right. So for China, it's the Chinese Communist Party, right? And people know that if decisions get made there, they will have a shelf life of longer than a few months, right? So it gives a coherence, it gives credibility to strategic thinking, to policy. Similarly, if you think of Vietnam, it's there. It's the party in power. If they make decisions, then good or bad, we can debate, but there is at least that credibility and coherence to that policy. Same with India, whether we like Modi government or not, but there is that coherence. That when you ask that question for, same with Bangladesh, but when you ask that question for Pakistan, what is that common core? Who has that credibility? If you think of the different stakeholders, the level of infighting and dysfunction has gone to a level that you can't even trust the Supreme Court of Pakistan, because even they have, the two groups at each other's throats, and it appears. Obviously, the political parties are fighting. That's perhaps more common across other countries as well. But the military used to be very powerful, or considered very powerful. It's actually not clear whether the military can call as many shots as they used to, because there has been this sort of, for of course, many historical reasons which are legitimate, pushback against militaries overreaching in every sphere of the economy and the society. And so there is more disagreement even within the institution about the role of the institution. But the net result of all of that is that what we don't have is that sense of a core that is making decisions. Those decisions are based on some semblance of sound principles. Some of them we've touched upon here. But in my view, and I partly see Reza is saying the same thing, that there is a need to somehow form that core where you can make some strategic decisions of how things are going to be different. And we have talked about some of the ways in which those things are going to be different. And I'll just re-emphasize the societal attitudes that need to be different going forward. The level of conversation needs to rise above conspiracy theories. And we didn't have time, Reza, to get into your favorite conspiracy theories. And which one are you really part of? We really wanted to figure that out. But grow up. As a society, as a country, you need to have a different attitude for making collective decisions. And that core, we really need to start with developing that core. I sometimes call it the nervous system of the country, where decisions get made and implemented. That basic core is missing. It's not going to be one, someone is going to come who's going to solve, one big, great leader. Unfortunately, that's not how things are going to work in Pakistan, in my view. It has to be some nodes of power coming together and agreeing on these rules of the game that are going to form the next norms for the country. Not the same norms that we have had, but new and different norms that are going to govern the country. That's at least my perspective on that. Reza, I'll give you the last minute, but thank you so much for giving us the time. Thank you all for coming in. I really apologize. The questions are terrific, but we did answer some of them in the course of our conversation, but we couldn't get to all of them, unfortunately. But thank you all for coming. Reza, you have the final word.
Thank you, Atif. I'll close, number one, thanking everybody for their time to be here, and to come back to the question with which we started. Is there a way forward? And coming back to what I got a very clear sense, including in Washington, D.C., including with investors, as to their perceptions of Pakistan right now, that it being too late. I don't think it's too late. I do think that there is a way forward. Pakistan came out of the COVID crisis very well. And COVID was arguably even a bigger crisis than Pakistan had, because at that point, the entire world was shut down. But it demonstrated, whether in public health, whether in bringing down public debt during COVID, whether in terms of cash transfer schemes done by the then minister in charge, Dr. Sanya. So I really feel that one can. I do hope that the way we come out of it is one that is driven by ownership. And by ownership, I mean that there is a realization on the part of Pakistanis themselves that we need to come up, we need to create a governance mechanism to address these problems. We come out of it with the realization that blame game and bashing other institutions or other external agents is not the way. And I hope and I really look forward to seeing that constellation comes about, and really we as Pakistanis take ownership that these are our problems, and in whatever capacity, each one of us rises to that challenge to make something good come out of this crisis. Thank you, Atif, and thank you everybody for spending the time today.